Emily, can you hear us? Okay.
David, we can hear you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, let's go ahead and get going. I just wanted a quick confirmation that everybody can see the PowerPoint pulled up. It's an agenda slide.
Yep.
Anyone with?
I think this is David. I think most people have also tied into the webinar directly, which is a good idea since you're going to hopefully be taking comments directly from the webinar since we don't have a face-to-face presence. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you, David. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Before we get rolling, I just wanted to extend a thank you to everybody for your flexibility this morning. Due to the challenges with I-5 travel, it was not possible for the Commerce team to make it up to Seattle, so thanks for the flexibility. We are going to do our best to adapt given the change in circumstances. Still plan to move through the presentations that we had planned for today. Some of the discussion and workshop activities may be difficult to do given the remote presence that most of us have, and so we are just going to do the best that we can. A quick note working through WebEx is any comments, questions, any information that you want to provide for the record, if you can please insert that into the chat box within WebEx, then we can be tracking and recording information that way. Anything that we want to add with that from a process note about WebEx?
No, I don't think so. Just submit them on the chat and we will get to them at a proper time.
All right. So just a quick agenda review, working from the slide that we have here in front of us. Today's agenda is we're going to do a quick overview about what we heard from the first workshop that we hosted on November 8th. We had planned to have some discussion about outreach and engagement. We are going to forego that topic, but we'll be engaging with you all via a SurveyMonkey to get some input on that topic specifically. We're going to spend most of our time together today doing presentations on building types, looking at a comparison between Ashrae Standard 100 and Portfolio Manager. And then we're going to be looking at building benchmarking and targets, so Ashrae sections 5 and 6. If time is available at the end and a willingness to have some discussion, we will do our best to facilitate that remotely and discuss building types, exempt buildings, spaces, and activities. Anything you want to add, Chuck?
Well, I'm going to weight this more heavily towards the second half of the agenda and a little less with the building types discussion. And we'll see how that goes. Where lunch falls, given our rejigger here, we'll have to see how that works out as well. I think this is going to be a lot more just presentation. And so we might move through the agenda a little quicker and we'll figure out when lunch fits in.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chuck. All right, quick introductions before we get started. My name is Emily Salzberg. I'm at the Washington State Department of Commerce, and I'm a managing director here in the Energy Division, focused on our buildings programs.
Chuck Murray. I'm Energy Policy Specialist here at Commerce, and I'm taking the technical lead on the development of the rules.
My name's Austin Sharf, and I'm the Energy Rules and Legislative Coordinator, assisting Emily and Chuck in the rulemaking process.
And Paul, do we have audio for you? Do you want to do a quick intro? All right, we've got Paul Currington. I'll do this on his behalf. Paul is providing our technical support, and thank you so much for that, Paul. It's been a unique challenge this morning. Just a quick note, we have added 2 new staff members to our team. Annika McDonald and Anna Beatty are going to be joining us here at the Department of Commerce, and I already have our December 4th workshop on their calendar, so they will be attending in person and have a chance to meet with you all at that point in time. Just a quick reminder, we do have our webpage set up for buildings on Commerce's website, and that is your go-to place for information, current updates, and information about the workshops and rulemaking that we are moving through. So there's a link for you. And also just a reminder of the building's email address. So buildings@commerce.wa.gov. That is an email address that lands in Chuck's inbox, mine, Austin's, and a couple others. So if you've got any questions or official correspondence that you want to send regarding clean buildings, that is the best avenue to do so. Just wanted to acknowledge we're working with a talented team, both internally here at Commerce and with many external folks as well. So just wanted to provide a quick note. We are working in close partnership with Washington State University Energy Program. David, Karen, and Jake are all working to support our efforts here with clean buildings. They're going to be providing quite a bit of technical assistance and ultimately providing customer support for the program as we move through startup. We're also working with SBW and the 2050 Institute. Faith and Poppy are going to be working closely with the Department of Commerce on EUI target setting. And I believe we have Poppy there in the room at the Smart Building Center. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I'm not going to hand the microphone around for every comment, but when you need to speak, anyone, please raise your hand.
David. All right, so just a quick note to ground our work together as we move through rulemaking. This is a helpful context setting for the work that we have in front of us with the Clean Buildings Initiative. This really is the intent behind the legislation that has become law. We've got an RCW reference there, but really in developing the energy performance standards, the department, which is Commerce, shall seek to maximize reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. So we just want to keep that at the forefront of folks' minds as we move through conversation. This likely will be a touchstone for us during many conversations. Just a quick review of the building's webpage. Again, this is your go-to for information about our clean buildings work. We've got our workshop schedules set up. Austin did a phenomenal job of getting all of the links for our future workshops posted, dates and topics for that. So we are updating as we move along. We've got our agendas posted there for future meetings and past meeting minutes, recordings, and presentations. And this is going to be essentially the portal and the go-to for information about rulemaking and submitting public comment about that. And again, we're updating as we go. All right, I wanted to just briefly provide some feedback about what we heard from the first workshop. Austin? Okay, so first and foremost, thank you so much for everybody that was able to participate in our first workshop. Coming away from that, we were very pleased to see the level of discussion, great questions that people put forward, and just active engagement. So thank you all. Before everybody left the room, I asked you to provide feedback on what worked well versus what didn't work well for that first workshop. So thanks for those comments. What we heard from you is the location is working well for many of you in the city of Seattle. There was a nice balance of both presentations and group activities. Using Seattle's existing program was a helpful example. Discussions were helpful in clarifying aspects of the law, and regular breaks were helpful and breakouts. So thanks for that feedback. We did take your input on areas for improvement to heart, and we'll be looking to modify our approach going forward. So we heard from you that having prep and reading materials ahead of time if needed would be great. We need more representation from building owners and property managers. We want to be more clear about who we're having present, have that information up front in the agenda, being clear about referring to sections in the law versus Ashrae Standard 100, encouragement to have conversations and meetings outside of Seattle in Spokane or Wenatchee area was the suggestion, and commerce participation in group breakouts. So thanks so much for that note. And we will do our best to modify our approach moving forward to make sure we're meeting as many needs as possible. Focusing on the slide that's up on the screen, we did have some great discussions about the content presented from workshop 1. What we had asked for was really identifying the important topics we really need to be talking about moving forward with rulemaking, and then we asked for folks to do some prioritization of those topics. So what you're seeing summarized on this slide is the a synthesis of all of that information. So the important topics that were identified were building types and EUI targets, cost-effective criteria, incentives and financing, alignment with other programs, carbon impacts and reductions, outreach for rulemaking workshops. So just a note for you all, thank you for that input, and we will be working to incorporate these discussion points into our agendas for our next sequence and series of meetings that we have scheduled through the end of the year. So thank you for that participation. Just a quick reminder of the schedule, and this is really just the schedule focused on getting through formal rulemaking. What we have is an obligation to publish final rules by November 1st of 2020, so just shy of a year from now. We have filed the CR Form 101, which is the code with the Code Revisor's Office, which starts formal rulemaking. That form has been filed, and we're working on a series of workshops here in November and December to get early input on the standard and how we structure our work moving forward. In the winter of 2020, we're going to be working on developing a methodology, setting draft targets, and input on draft rules. We're going to be working heavily with the SBW team to engage in that discussion with us. Spring of 2020, we'll continue with workshops, input, and publish the CR 102 form with the intent to do public hearings and finalizing the rules in summer of 2020. So those rules can publish in fall of 2020. Before we turn it over to Chuck about the presentation content, I wanted to give Austin a moment to talk about public comments and how that process will move here with the Department of Commerce.
So, Emily?
Yes.
Hannon, I have a question.
Go ahead, Greg. Greg, your audio is not coming through right now.
We cannot hear you, Greg.
We're having some technical fixes. There we go. The one issue that was not on the list that I thought was important to many of us was the cost of the overall program to building owners. I think that needs to be identified as one of the issues that we need to continue to focus on. Analyzing the actual cost of the requirements to building owners.
Okay, thank you so much for that note, Greg. Much appreciated, and we will weave that into our agenda in future meetings in December.
Perfect. So looking forward, at the end of our last meeting, we discussed getting some general public comments from you guys about your concerns, your specific recommendations for approach, and maybe even some case studies that you may know of that you would like to share with us. I've requested those comments be back to us on December 2nd. It gives you, I think, 3 weeks from the prior time. We give a little bit longer for that period so that you guys can help gather your thoughts and review some of the materials. This is, again, it's a very general thing, and we can revisit the specifics as we go. Then we'll look at trying to space these public comments, which should be submitted to our buildings email page. Every 2 weeks, we will look at December 6th for the comments from this section. And then we'll be looking at December 20th following. And then we'll go from there. If you have suggestions for how we do public comments, you've been more than, please send them our way. Thank you.
Austin. All right, Chuck.
Good morning, everyone. Today is a technical discussion about some of the sections in Standard 100. Mostly it's about methodology, not about the actual end result answers. We're going to discuss the crossover between requirements in the RCWs and Standard 100. And then we're going to discuss how an individual building owner, the energy manager in charge of the building, develops their own specific EUI target. I think that'll help folks throughout the discussion, simply knowing how that target's developed. They'll see both the restraints and the flexibility that's provided there. So without ado, I'm going to start by talking about building types. Our RCW says we may consider building occupancy classifications from Standard 100 or US EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So that puts some boundaries on this and gets us started. So within the context of Standard 100, which you'll see on your pages here in red, and once again, your RCW quotes will be in blue. That helps people tell one from the other. Hopefully that'll be useful. You know, Standard 100 energy targets are arranged in first. There's table 7-1, which is simply a list of all the covered building types in Standard 100. Of course, we might modify that. The next table, 7-2A, illustrates site-based energy targets. I'll show you how those are used in a little bit. And there's also an operating shifts adjustment factor, table 7-3, in the context of Standard 100. This is just a clip of Standard 100's buildings page. Table 7-1 provides the list of buildings covered in the standard currently. I recommend folks go review that when they're thinking about making specific comments. Then once again, now this is a table that I've modified based on table 7-2A of the building standard. I've simply cut out all the other climate zones and have the two that are in effect here in Washington. Once again, list the building types and the reference target. And then there's also shift normalization factors. These are multipliers that are applied to the base UI in 7-2A, multiplied by the table 7-3 factor in order to come up with the target for that end use. Now we're also able to take advantage of the EPA Energy Star building types. You'll see here that there's broad categories, then it gets focused down into primary functions, and then after that they do provide areas of further breakdown. But you'll also see by this example that they do some binning. For example, under education, vocational school and other school are binned into one site EUI target. I anticipate, regardless of what we choose for building types, in order to make sure that we have a well-defined EUI target, that some binning will be required. At the same time, folks will, by these definitions, be able to see what most likely applies to their particular building type. This would be true for, you know, items on the list for Ashrae Standard 100 as well. We'll develop a way to provide good definitions so folks know which EUI target is applicable to their building type. So I'm going to conclude this conversation fairly quickly today, simply because, well, I'm going to make a few statements and I'll pause and get a few quick comments. But I really do think people need to take some time to review these, both the Energy Star list of building types as well as what's in Standard 100, provide any feedback you might have. But once again, I've said this before, it seems logical to align with the Energy Star portfolio manager building types. They're already required by another RCW. This is our benchmarking RCW in the state of Washington. But I also want to comment that building types are also going to be dependent on our EUI target setting work. Poppy's in the room. The process of actually gathering the data, setting the EUI targets will in itself reveal what buildings we can bin together, which ones need individual targets, kind of the scope overall of what buildings can have unique targets and which ones will get binned, as I noticed. You know, not every building will have a unique EUI target. You know, similar things will be put together. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm not going into a great deal of depth here. There'll be more discussion on this when we start talking about development of the EUI targets. But I will pause and allow any comments folks might have at this time.
For comments, we have our chat box open. We also, you should be able to have the ability to unmute yourself and make a comment. We just ask that you mute yourself again so we don't have the phone static or anything else for the duration of the presentation. There is one chat from Amy about the dates and topics listed somewhere, and I'm guessing that is for public comment. These, the current date of December 4th and the questions we are asking for the last presentation are online under that presentation, which is under past workshops on the webpage. I believe it's under the document questions and concerns going forward. So look at that, and again, you can submit that to the Clean Buildings or the buildings at commerce.wa.gov email address.
So I have another question. I think it's because I put the slide up that we have right here. The question is, what's the difference between source and site EUI values? First, let me say that our law specifies we use site EUI. Site EUI is the energy measured at the building, typically through your energy meters or by way of recording how many gallons of fuel might be delivered via truck or some other means. So that's site EUI. Source EUI is a methodology of determining how much energy was used to create that end use energy. For example, a very efficient gas-fired generator that creates electricity is only about 50% efficient. So with that as an example, the source EUI would be about double what the site is. Once again, though, we're not using source energy. We'll be using site energy for all our target setting. Any other questions? All right. Once again, we'll talk more about this. Oh, well, let's see. So will we be discussing additional opportunities for adjustments to EOI targets outside of the shift factors for unique instances? Yes. Today, that's kind of our wrap up towards the end. I'll be soliciting more input on that information. I'm going to provide a few examples of some comments we've received already. So that is on the agenda today, at least to introduce that conversation, if not dive into it a little bit. Let me make sure I'm not missing any questions here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep this rolling. So there are a good number of questions that have come up over the last few days about, well, few months really, about the scope of this, what buildings are required to comply, which buildings aren't, what uses might be excluded from the EOI target of the building, things like that. If I were really good at my job, I would have done a nice map of all these exceptions I'm about to show you. I'm not that good at my job yet. In a future meeting, I'll try and have that. Today, I'm going to walk through it using the text that's provided in the RCW and in Standard 100. So first, Standard 100 scope. It applies to existing buildings, portions of buildings, and building complexes, including the envelope and all systems in the building. The standard excludes industrial and agricultural processes in buildings for which the energy targets do not include those processes. An example of a process, an industrial process that may not be in the building type, let me think. It could be a large machine that creates a product located in a warehouse. Obviously, the warehouse EUI is not typically going to include that machine's energy use, and somehow we would figure out how that gets excluded as we develop our reporting tools. A process that probably is included is, say, an office building with a data center. A lot of office buildings have data center. All our EUI targets or all our reported EUI that we'll be using to develop targets probably has some form of computing in it. And we'll have to ferret out, how much of that's typically included in an office building. So those are some examples. Now I'm moving to the general definition that's in RCW for this law. This defines the covered commercial building. Sum of non-residential hotel, motel, and dormitory floor areas exceed 50,000 gross square feet, excluding the parking garage area. So you have a building and the assessor's office tells us it's 60,000 square feet, but the building owner reports that 12,000 square feet of that is actually parking area. Not be a covered building under this law. So that gives you an idea of, one consideration where the building would be exempt based on the rule. So we've been over this before, but now I'm going to go through the RCW Section 7. These are both our statutes. Well, this is our statutes reporting rate criteria. All building owners are going to have to report what they meet here as a condition, including exemptions. So if the building's exempt, we're going to have to develop a way for the building owner to notify us that they believe they're exempt and report to us. The general conditions are on the board here. Most buildings will fall under Section A. They're going to report that their EUI, their energy use intensity, is less than the target, or they're going to, gain a conditional compliance from by, submitting appropriate documentation to Commerce, and they'll be reporting that they've met the standard through conditional compliance. That's going to be the bulk of the work, but now I'm going to go through all the exceptions that the law also allows. Once again, they'll have to be reported to Commerce, but if you qualify for one of these exceptions, you'll be able to simply report that. So first exception is for buildings that don't have certificate of occupancy the previous 12 months, or did not have an average physical occupancy of at least 50%, meaning a building that has a good deal of vacancies in it. If the time period before reporting is required, the building's half empty or more, simply report that to Commerce and your reporting requirements are completed. Now, I just did a big jump and crossed over into Standard 100, Section 7, which has additional exemptions or modifications allowed for vacant or partially occupied buildings. So for a vacant building, the energy target is based on the previous activity. Now, this probably won't apply once we develop our rules, simply because we have that 50% vacant. Well, let me see. Yeah, physical occupancy and vacancy is likely going to be the same thing when we develop our rules. So, with respect to this first section, it's probably simply 50% will be the number above. The next section is if the total floor area of the non-heated, non-cooled, and non-illuminated vacant part of the building is smaller than 30% of the gross floor area, then it can be excluded from the gross floor area, and the energy target shall be determined based on the remainder of the building. So there's a little ambiguity. Well, first of all, if you've got a 100,000 square foot building and you're 25% vacant, you're going to be allowed to delete that 25% from your EUI target under this particular rule. Now, once again, there's some crossover in a future rule that we're going to have to look at here. So I'm going to have to catch up on that. So the remaining part of the building that is not vacant would simply have to meet the UI target for that 75,000 square feet of floor area I gave you, the remaining amount. And this next thing is when the vacant part of the building is heated and or cooled, and the building energy use data for a recent 12 consecutive month period when the building was occupied is not available, compliance of this part of the building will be determined after it becomes occupied. So the previous statement, requires you to be able to exclude the 30% or less floor area, assuming you have the metered data. The second part is how it's handled if there is no metered data available. Once again, we're going to have to map these and make sure we understand all the different overlaps of the standards. And I'll be taking that on here in the next few weeks. Now I'm bouncing back to the RCW. Once again, we just talked about mostly vacant buildings or portions of buildings that are vacant, so I thought it was relevant to flip back and forth between the RCW and the standard. Back to the RCW now. The sum of the building's gross floor area minus unconditioned and semi-conditioned spaces as defined by the Washington State Energy Code is less than 50,000 square feet. That is true. That building doesn't need to comply. So that's a 100,000 square foot warehouse with a 30,000 square foot office. The warehouse is unconditioned. In a minute here, you'll see that the office is insulated between the office and the warehouse. Then that building would be considered exempt simply because there isn't 50,000 square feet of fully conditioned space. Now the Energy Code creates some tricks that make it a little more difficult. So a conditioned space, is space that's fully heated and isolated from other spaces that you might want to call unconditioned. For example, when you read this conditioned space definition, if there is an uninsulated wall between the conditioned space and the unconditioned space, or the semi-heated space, you're heating that adjacent space and you're not exempt from the conditioned space requirement. So once again, read this conditioned space definition carefully, and you'll see that it really does limit how the space is defined. Now, a way to take care of that might be to insulate the wall between the office and the warehouse. You just shrink your building that's required to qualify, and that might be one way to get through this. Semi-heated space is a space with no cooling, and it has limited space heating input. That's also an exempt space provided it's well isolated from the conditioned space. Now the State Energy Code doesn't define unconditioned space. It It's general knowledge in the field that unconditioned space is simply not one of the two defined spaces above. Well, let me get through one more. Now, there's a couple other definitions that may be useful because there are requirements in the standard for refrigerated warehouses. These aren't specified in the law or in the standard, but here's some definitions I think might be worth considering simply because they've been established through our energy code for many years. So I'm going to, before I move on to the next section here, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. Once again, I'm going to try and create a matrix that helps people through a decision tree here. I understand this is a little hard to follow all the nuances. All right, so the next thing that is exempt by the RCW is manufacturing or the primary use of the building is manufacturing or other industrial purposes as defined by the following use designations in the International Building Code. It's factory group F or high hazard group H, which is simply another factory designation, but with hazardous things going on typically. The way this is handled, for example, in the Seattle benchmarking rules is that either they dig up the building permit of record that defines this particular building, or the building owner is given the opportunity to present evidence that it meets building code definition. And I provided a link here. I'm not sure what's going to happen when I open this. Nothing. So alt.
Hold on 1 second, guys.
We're going to try and open this link because I think it provides an additional layer of detail. Works fine on your desktop computer, of course.
Should now see the 2018 International Building Code page, Chapter 3.
So, Chapter 3 of the Building Code has all the occupancy classifications and uses. This is where you go to find the definitions of what would be a factory group. And here it is, section 306, factory group F. And let's see if they'll let me magnify it here. Well, they did, but now I lost my place. Okay, so you'll see that they have a fairly simple definition, followed by a good many examples. That doesn't mean that you're limited by all those examples. It just gives you some boundaries and allows you to think about it. Also look at the fact that, for example, Group S storage is not included here. So when you're thinking about these definitions, also read to what is excluded from the definition. Any rate, so the one I liked when I looked through it is that a moderate hazard is beverages over 16% alcohol content. Where you get down to your low hazard groups are beverages up to 16% alcohol content. So that was a nice finding here in the building code today. I hope that's useful. Your high hazard groups, once again, they're primarily factory groups that have more requirements for fire protection and egress because of their hazardous storage and use of chemicals. So it's simply another industrial process classification. Want to take me back to my slideshow, Austin?
I will move us in that direction. Oh, good to go.
All right. The other exemption we talked about factories is an agricultural structure. And this is a definition that it's included in the statute. And it's important to note that it's for horticultural activities, but it's not for agricultural process or packaging. You know, those are more on the those probably fall into your manufacturing processes above. In most cases, if they don't, they would have to meet the standard. I also want to note that these industrial processes are later exempted in Standard 100 when folks are doing energy audits. The building is still required to comply. Let's say it's a 100,000 square foot building and only a small portion of that building houses an industrial process. That building would still need to comply. The energy use of all the spaces would need to be included, except you could, when you do your energy audits for buildings that are outside of the scope, you wouldn't have to include those industrial, ag, or irrigation loads in the energy audit portfolio. Here is another set of exemptions specified by the RCW. These are mostly financial hardship exemptions. They give a list of 6 of them, and then they give an additional line there for the department to develop by rule. This is your cue if you have another financial hardship that you'd like to share with us that we might consider by rule. This is your opportunity to contact us with that recommendation. So once again, that's a little bit of a rough tour through all the exemptions. I promise I'll get better in the future. Are there any questions right now? They come from the top down.
I think this one's for me here. We're kind of getting caught back up on the chat function here. Amy suggests something on the web page such as dates on written comments rather than embedded inside the presentation. Do something like that up there, and if continue to make changes to that process, we are open to it.
Anything else?
Have to repeat that question for us if there was a question that came in from someone else.
Yeah, I'm pausing to read a question here. It's rather lengthy. It's a comment more. For agricultural process, there's a need for more and detailed discussion on agricultural processes. I'm particularly interested in tree fruit processing. What components of the process equipment will be exempted? No need to respond at this meeting. So they provided a phone number and contact. Thank you for the contact info. That's always useful. Concerning exemption, subtracting semi-conditioned spaces. The semi-conditioned space EUI per WSCC may change over time with future variations of the code. Would it be best to lock the semi-conditioned EUI in this law? Yes, we'll port whatever definitions we need out of the WSCC to this set of rules so that they will not change without you know, a rulemaking relative to this particular document. Please verify the EUIs will be based on a 12-month period, even if the building is only used part of the year, such as refrigerator warehouses that are used seasonally. Yes, it's a 12-month period. You know, we have an adjustment factor for hours of use for most buildings, hours per year. The standard says nothing about, you know, temporary occupancy versus full-time occupancy and whether or not there's adjustment allowed. I'm not suggesting we're going to do that, but I'm simply saying that it would be consistent with the rules we have in order to adopt something like that. So I'm simply saying that no rule currently exists that would do that, and that the EUI is currently based on an annual number. We can discuss that further as well. All right, David, why don't you look around the room and ask people if they want to keep jamming here or if they want a 5-minute break?
I'm hearing, I think, a request for a 5-minute break. Would that be good?
Yeah.
All right. I got consensus. All right. So we're going to take, let's take 5 minutes.
Let's reconvene at 11:05.
All right, folks, 11:05. Time to come up with more questions if you have them, or take a break. Right, our clock just rolled over. I'll give everybody another minute to get settled in the room. I see old people chatting and moving around still. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions that came in during our chat. So the question is, how will Commerce address future changes in the Ashrae 100 standards relative to the rule? We're going to have a fixed standard 100. Right now, the current standard is the 2018 version of standard 100. That'll be fixed in our rule set unless sometime between now and 2026 the rules are reopened for some reason. I don't anticipate that. So we'll maintain a fixed standard until the rules are reopened. The next one is standard 100. 3 UI tables and IP units are given. There's site energy targets, site electricity targets, and site fossil fuel targets. So far, I've only addressed 7.2a, which are the site energy targets. How do the other two fit in? Our legislation specifies that the buildings will be graded on a site EUI. I've always assumed that meant we're using the combined target of all the different fuels rolled into one unit, which is 7.2a, and that's why I've been referring to it. That said, during rulemaking, folks are able to make additional comments if they care to. But that's my read of what our law tells us to do, unless somebody else has a different flow of logic here. Before I dive in, once again, anyone want to venture a question in the room or online? Moving through our agenda pretty quickly here today. All right. It's tough working in a room with no feedback, by the way, just so you know. So the next thing I'm going to do here is talk about how you apply the rule set in section 7. This is how a building owner would develop a unique EUI target for the building. Every building has their own target, depending on the uses in the building, hours of operation, and other variables we might come up with. So this is the work of the energy manager or qualified person. Now remember our last webinar, I presented cast of characters. These are defined terms in the definitions of standard 100. That's where you learn what the qualifications for these two people are. So basically what it says here that the energy manager or qualified person shall determine the energy target for their building either in accordance with 7.2.2 for single type activity buildings or 7.2.3 for mixed use. And I'm going to walk you through basically how that gets built up, which will weigh into, some further discussions about probably building types as well as some of the rules on how some grouping of building types are accommodated in the standard. First, once again, I've created my own set of building activities with specific EUITs for the 2 climate zones here in Washington. I put those into Excel and I matched them up with table 7-3, which are my shift normalization factors. So these are our source documents currently. Now, once again, we're going to look at 7-2A, building types and the targets through a process that we'll be discussing in a future meeting. But just for reference of this activity, I've just used what's published in Standard 100. So this is built up using, this is the single activity methodology. Basically, what I've done here is chosen the building under consideration is all admin professional office type. I've determined that by reading the definitions for that particular building type. I've said that this building's normal operating hours are 51 to 67 hours per week. And, you know, you multiply 40 times 1 and the energy utilization target for that building is 40. That's about all there is to it for single occupancy buildings. I'm going to illustrate the energy targets for buildings with multiple activities in several steps so you can follow along. In this case, I've put in an admin professional office building, and it also has a restaurant cafeteria. And it's the Waffle House. It's open 24 hours a day. So it gets to use the highest operating shift multiplier. So you can see that for each space, I've determined the EUIT by space. But now I have to go to step 2 where we weight that particular the spaces. So our office tower, 280,000 square feet, and our Waffle House is 22,000 square feet. And as a percent of the total, you'll see those represented there. 93% of it is professional office. To finish the exercise, it's quite simple. You multiply the EUIT in red here times the percent of the building that hits that. So 40 times 0.93 is 0.371. And the 327, which is your Waffle House, is only 7% of the energy target. So that comes out being 23.9. So the EUIT for the building, the full weighted EUIT is 61. So that's a fairly simple example of how a multi-unit or multi-occupancy building is calculated. Of course, there's going to be possibility of many different occupancies given the classifications. It's the work of the energy manager to keep track of this. First, they're going to need to identify the space types. They're going to need to be able to understand how intensely they're used with respect to operating shifts. They have to keep that data up to speed over the year. And then once again, they'll be required to do this weighting exercise that we put down here. Are there any questions with regards to this particular part of section 7? Wait, there's more. So I just wanted to toss in an example where there may be admin professional offices where part of the building is operated more than 67 hours, where another part of the building is operated in that middle category of weekly operating hours. Now, just because a few people in the office building, 10, 11% of the office space is operated for long hours doesn't mean the whole building gets classified that way. So this adds another layer of detail that would have to be considered when you're developing your EUIT. I know a lot of buildings where, 8 to 5 is the rule, and then there's a few spaces where it's very intense, lots of hours. Our State Patrol's building might be a good example. Most of that building is empty during off of regular hours, but there's an office space there that's always manned, and it would certainly fall into this, second category. So that's an example that I think, just to add a little detail to how an energy manager would develop their area weighted EUIT. Now there are some exceptions that allow you to group different spaces, allow you to consider what parts of a building, well, how you classify a building in this case. So the exceptions follow the multi-use UIT settings. First, spaces where more than 75% of the gross floor area has a unique building activity shall be reported as a single-use building or as a multi-use building in accordance with the single-use occupancy or the section covering multi-use occupancy. Now, I built a couple examples that allow us to examine whether or not we think that's a good rule. So, given that first example, the building owner would be allowed to choose an EUIT of 40 or 61. Now, I'm willing to bet that the building owner's going to pick 61. That gives them lots of headroom on, the varying occupancies, and that's the least restrictive path. So that seems to make sense. Sounds like a rule that's fair. But I'm going to flip this around, and I'm going to imagine that 76% of the floor area is a hospital, and that comes with an EUIT of 135. And a huge portion of this building is also commercial office, 24%. So the choice for the building owner, given this rule, would be they could pick the 135 or the 112. You can see how this question gets flipped around depending on what the occupancies and ratio of occupancies are. We can discuss whether or not we think this rule is fair or equitable. Perhaps my example's kind of far-flung, perhaps it's not. But that's the discussion we need to have as part of rulemaking, I think. The next exception, space less than.
Chuck, we have a question. We have a question.
Sure. I can't hear you. Make sure the mic's on.
Okay, sorry about that. So for the admin professional office, would that have to be associated with the operation and the function of the hospital and inpatient health, or would it be a completely separate business line to make that division? Is it a space or a kind of a use and business differentiation?
Well, so let's say the way to really develop the appropriate target UI would be to divvy those spaces out.
A quick comment, can we have the microphone in the room turned up, make sure that's off, we're getting some echo.
At any rate, once again, this is to some extent up to us to determine the rules. That's what we're doing. My take is that a building, certainly with this much office space in it, and this isn't medical office, this is just professional office space, should really be considered separately when the building is, when the energy utilization target is developed. Some of this is going to be dependent on the resolution of our energy utilization target setting that's discovered by SBW, Faith, and Poppy, who's there in the room. So I don't really have a great answer for that right now, but my gut is that to do this right, you calculate the different spaces differently. But once again, this is what we're here to discuss.
And then my follow-up question would be, I presume from that answer and your comment earlier in this presentation that Commerce in the state would intention to build its own table, EUI table. Is that sort of the end product that you're anticipating?
That's correct. Department of Commerce is required by the law to create energy utilization targets similar to that table 7-2A that I've shown you. It's based on largely on the regional data we have here. We can rely also on the national data if our regional data isn't sufficient, but we're trying to create it based on what we know about our own building stock. So that is an activity that we've hired SBW and the 2050 Institute to do.
I've got another question. What happens if a space or part of a space changes use, like say during the middle of the year? So you've got 6 months in one function and then 6 months in a different function. How do you modify the EUI target for that?
I don't know. If you think we need instruction, we should probably figure out how to set that in rule.
I had a question on, I see how you're doing this kind of a weighted average use on multi-use buildings, but what do you do when the hours, the activities don't change, but seasonal variations in shifts, like part of the year, 2/3 of the year, you're single shift, 1/3 of the year, you're double shift, or you just increase your hours during the year. How do you account for those variations with this math?
standard doesn't currently address that. Once again, that's a comment that we might want to consider here. So I'm going, is there another question in the room?
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Sorry. So I had the question earlier about if we were going to talk about, alternative adjustment factors. And so I know that the AIA group has sent over a memo with some points to discuss there, and I just want to make sure that we're talking about that a little bit since that's kind of where we are in the agenda today. So just in general, how else are we going to adjust for kind of unique energy using features in the sense of, different building types have different factors that are going to swing this pretty wildly beyond just hours of usage. There's, occupant densities for office buildings, type of labs is going to be totally different for a wet lab versus a dry lab. What type of cooking facilities are in a grocery store? Can we talk a little bit about what the plan is for additional adjustment factor allowances?
So we're about to get to that. I'm going to handle a few more questions, and then we'll move right along into that.
Sounds great. Thank you.
There's a question here, what's the process to challenge the EUI target for special case buildings? We're going to be having rulemaking discussions for a number of months now. We'll be receiving folks' arguments throughout the process here in order to figure out what a special case buildings is, how a challenge would be made. We can work all that out through the next few months. Who/what will determine the building use square footage used in the UI calculations? So the building owner and their representatives, led by the energy manager, will be providing those calculations. Now, as a function of Commerce's administrative requirements, obligations, those calculations will likely be subject to audit. Those are rules we need to develop still, but I assume that it will be, the building owner and their team report, and some group of folks will be subject to audit. How will patio and sidewalk heating loads be accounted for? If it's not part of the conditioned space, will it be considered a unique load exempt? I haven't figured that out. Certainly, I don't recall seeing anything in the standard that exempts, say, parking lot lighting or other outdoor loads that are provided by the building meter. If it's essential that we exempt those, somehow we have to have an accounting function that allows us to make sure that the rest of the building's properly accounted for. So once again, that's a tough case. It's not covered here, but worthy of consideration. All right, I'm going to give a couple more examples related to the exemptions under this calculation methodology. Once again, spaces less than 10% of the gross floor area. The unique building activity can be combined with the floor area of similar building activities. We're going to need to define a little more we're going to have a better definition for what similar means. Does that mean that two spaces that have a similar EUI? So that's something we're going to have to work through as well. What's similar mean with respect to this 10%? Okay, now we're getting into the complicated exemptions to the target development. So this exemption allows up to 10% of a building, maybe a building type that is not listed if separately metered. So, you know, we're going to have a set of, say, 40 different building types where we have an EUI target. And if you have a space that is not listed in that list of building types and it's separately metered, you can take that space, square footage, and the EUI target out of your target setting activity. Now that doesn't create an exception for that floor area, it just revises the target. Now, why is this a useful thing? I'm just throwing out a reminder, if you can't build a target because you have a building that's not, the building type isn't mappable to any of our EUI targets, you have to proceed to sections 8 and 9, which are the audit and improve category. So there's a good motivation to figure out how to get your building, figure out how to get that into the target setting category. And this is one of the ways that they've allowed some flexibility towards that end. So this is kind of the flip side of the previous one. Once again, this is about buildings with activities not listed in Table 7-1. And it's more than 10%, but not more than 50% of the gross floor area. Shall comply with either Section 7.2.3 Exception 3, which is the one we just read, or it leads you through all the compliance activities and directs you once again to 4.3.3, which is buildings without energy targets, which essentially says must comply with sections 8 and 9. So once again, they are trying to allow a little flexibility here, but you're strongly motivated to try and develop a target for your building. Once again, I'm going to have to map this one out, draw some drawings in order to fully understand and communicate this particular exemption. All right, let's see. Before I move to a conversation about about developing our targets and unique targets, I'm going to cover a few more questions that have come in. For the benchmarking and building tune-up policies in Seattle, we require buildings to update their King County assessor square footage information if it differs significantly from what's currently reported to King County. The county will send out an assessor to verify the square footage, or they accept ANSI or BOMA certified measurements submitted by the taxpayer. So this seems to be a recommendation to limit the number of audit exercises Commerce may have to undertake by relying on other professionals. Not all assessors actually track square footage of buildings. I think we'd be twisting their arm pretty hard to make them do it, but I'm going to certainly look in this ANSI BOMA certified measurement process and see if we can utilize that to help us with our administrative obligations. Okay. We're probably gonna get through early today, the rate we're going here. So, in developing targets for buildings, once again, this is from our statute. Let's develop energy use intensity targets that are no greater than the average energy use intensity for the covered commercial building occupancy type, with adjustments for unique energy using features. The department may also develop energy use intensity targets for additional property types eligible for incentives. Those are our multifamily occupancies. We're to consider regional and local building energy utilization data, such as existing Energy Star benchmarking data, and establishing targets. Energy use intensity targets must be developed for 2 or more climate zones and be representative of energy use in a normal weather year. So that's our general guidance on establishing targets. There's another section that allows us to set different targets for newer buildings that have been constructed under a more modern energy code. But I want to talk about a few of the comments we've got about additional adjustments folks want to consider. These are some of the comments mentioned earlier from AIA. I just clipped a few. I'm expecting to get more from folks. But for example, offices vary greatly. One of the largest impacts is plug loads based on the number of people in the building. And they're advocating that more people per square foot is probably has a lower energy and environmental footprint overall, and we should encourage that. So can we include FTE as a variable? And that's a recommendation. We'll examine it and see if we can fit that in. There's a formula provided in Energy Star benchmarking. There are technical documents, but I want to caution us that we can't just adopt that whole cloth, because their activity is binning all the different energy uses, not in determining an average, which is a little bit different. And so certainly that's a good one to consider, particularly for offices. Perhaps there's other occupancies where that sort of variable is important as well. We'd like to hear from you. So the next one, they give a couple of good examples. I'm going to use schools. The example, some schools are only open short hours. They just do classroom activities from 9 till 3. People in the office, maybe they have a kitchen, maybe they don't. And then there are other schools that serve as the community center where they schedule all sorts of activities throughout the week. This is a suggestion that we figure out a way to accommodate that. I think the building hours example that we already have in standard 100 is pretty good, but certainly we can examine whether or not that's adequate. Specific subuses should be considered. They provide some examples. Kitchens in fire stations or dormitories, or just about any building type that has a kitchen. Different kinds of restaurants. Some have very energy intensive cooking methods and others don't. Grocery stores that sell all food types versus just a dry shelf items. And then we've already talked a little bit about server rooms in office buildings. How does that fit into our scheme? Now, I think that we need to identify which of these uses are dominant in a 50,000 or greater square foot building. You know, some of these may or may not have a big impact, particularly, you know, certainly a cafeteria is recognized as a space type and the energy utilization targets, the example I gave for this, and it would be balanced out by the square footage that it occupies in the building. So once again, we can look at these things, create a matrix of what we need to examine and move forward. I'm encouraging folks to put in their suggestions so we know what the scope is that we're going to examine. So we got a comment that every single building is unique, whether by virtue of its age, location, usage type, shell and core architecture, mechanical systems, interior design, or any combination or offshoot of the above. I think that particular comment I can't fully address, but we will look at some of those variables and whether or not they fit in the standard or not. And then simply a comment that several examples of unique building uses were provided during our recent meeting on why more, not less building types is better. Using Energy Star because it's convenient will likely result in lots of exceptions or buildings with unrealistically high targets. Quite frankly, I'm having a little bit of a hard time figuring out exactly what we're after with this particular comment. I do think the first phrase in this sentence is important, that people are going to want to be able to benchmark and create targets for their buildings. A good set of targets that they can use to build their building specific EUI target out of it is very important. We take that seriously, and we'll do the best we can in order to create that framework. All right, so I'm going to read written questions, comments here first, and then we'll go back and open up questions to the room. The only additional comment we got is all fire stations have kitchens, but very few will be affected by this code. There is a single building in Seattle that's going to be greater than 50,000 square feet is a fire station. So that's just a comment. Thank you. Once again, when we look through, you know, this, all the possible things that could be different about a building, we need to figure out which ones are most relevant for this work. I think I'm going to finish. Well, let me ask if there's anybody in the room or online that would like to speak up and provide a comment at this time.
Yes, you had mentioned earlier in your presentation that there would be more further information or discussion about these nuances of setting the targets. It's unclear to me in the upcoming meetings which one that might be. Could you be specific as to which one you have intention to talk about exactly how this is going to be, or your proposals or your plans for how this is going to be laid out for our comment?
So in December, one of the 2 meetings in December, and we'll post that on our website so it's very clear, we'll begin the discussion about the methodology, but we're still going to be collecting information on from folks that, you know, on what their unique variables are they're most concerned about. Variables we think we can come to some conclusion on, which will feed into the actual methodology development, which will be discussed coming in January in detail. So that's my response to your question right now. Emily, do you have any comments?
No, only comment is just to note in January, we're going to have a meeting with SBW specifically to address that topic, gather input and hear feedback and to have further discussion. The date yet is not determined, but we will put that on our website likely in the next week or so.
Right. And Poppy, you're in the room. Anything you want to add to this discussion? What do you folks need? What's your request?
Hi, I just got the microphone. This is Poppy. Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would add is that in the upcoming meetings in December, we'll be getting into a little bit more of a breakdown of some of the categories of assumptions that we need to look at in order to develop the methodology that we'll be presenting in early 2020. So we'll be putting out more detailed agendas on specific input we would be requesting. And we really will still be in a listening mode at that point because we will not have solidified the methodology, but we'll have a little bit more of a framework to present to everybody so that you can start seeing how this might start to come together. And then we will be presenting the actual draft methodology in 2020. Getting input on that before we actually move forward with the development of the targets.
So we have a question here about methodology. How important is it to have local EUI data to develop building types versus having lots of building types? And we're gonna have to weigh that as we move through the process. I think it's too early to tell how that works out. And then the next question is, will Commerce eventually create a template tool spreadsheet that energy managers can use to develop EUI targets? Well, I don't know exactly what tools we'll develop yet. We certainly have good intentions to develop tools everyone can use. That both simplifies the work that the energy managers are going to do, and it also creates uniform reporting so Commerce administrative duties are easier. So yeah, we'll be putting tools together as we move along. Okay. I am all but one slide done with my presentation. We've got the on
You have reached
from
the city of phone number that is no longer in use. If you believe you've reached this number in error, please hang up and try again.
all in user 8.
Oh, they're gone.
All right. So, with the exception of one small administrative comment here, we've gotten done very early. I think it's the nature of us being on the speaker box and a little less interaction than we might have normally anticipated. So I guess it's a time to ask if there are any more questions on what we've heard so far today.
What we'll do is we will open the phone lines here. We will unmute everybody so people who have just called in can speak up. So we will do that here in 1 second. I have to stop sharing the slide to do this. Back. All right, so if you have a question, please stop. Understanding of others.
Yeah, that didn't work at all, did it? I guess if you want to speak, is there a way people raise their hand or
They
something?
can raise their hands if they're not the people who've called in on phone, but people who are on the, or there's always the chat box. So let's go back.
Yeah.
Let's open the chat box.
Hi, I have another question related to the comment set that the AIA group sent. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about possibility to, in some way, address energy source as a way to address greenhouse gas emissions beyond just looking at an overall site target. I know there was a couple suggestions sent over, and has that been discussed at all, or is that going to be part of the further discussions in December?
Yeah, I haven't really considered those comments fully, and I'm certainly my colleagues haven't. So I'm a little reluctant to dive in right now. I will acknowledge that your group isn't the only group of folks that have mentioned this. People want carbon emissions reductions to be more directly addressed here. Now, we haven't brought it up on the agenda yet, so we haven't necessarily heard the other side of that story yet. So we'll make sure we put it on a future agenda and make sure we take comments on that.
Great, thank you.
So forklifts. How do we handle forklifts? Forklift propane. Once again, I'm going to have to put that on my list of things to think about. It likely falls into one of those process loads, but I'm going to have to consider whether or not that load is part of a typical building of that type or not. So we'll have to think about that. And then when we'll be developing various compliance, let's see, let me read the whole thing. Oh, we've got a lot more coming in here. I'm not keeping up. That's okay. I just got to start in the right place. Question is essentially, acknowledges that we'll be talking about targets in the winter of 2019. Will we be developing administrative procedures and procedures for incentive payments? Yes, that will intensify as we move forward. We'll be doing that in what we've called the winter, which is by our schedule, January through March. I'm sure we'll have both introductory meetings as well as more opportunities to comment on rules that get refined from those introductory meetings. So yes, we'll be having conversations about the administrative procedures and the incentive payments. Are vehicle charging stations exempt? I think that makes sense. We'll have to figure out how that works. Are they sub-metered? May be considered the same way we consider that 10% of floor area or less that you exempt out. Other ideas on how those are exempted, we'll have to work on that. So this next one's clever. It's great when you put out a set of rules, people start thinking about all the ways this might go. Will the exemptions outlined in section 7.2 be applied first to determine the square footage that is subject to various compliance deadlines? In other words, could the exemptions put a building into a later compliance date tier? I don't have an answer for that today. It's certainly a reasonable suggestion, and we'll put it on our list of things to think about. Comment on building types. Portfolio manager has over 90 building types in the tool and reports out 2 levels of building type. The main building type has about 20 or so types, which the city of Seattle primarily reports. Many of the additional buildings type are a breakout of the other type. Commerce could expand beyond the standard 20 types to include more detailed targets for certain types. For special use buildings, other will be a struggle, but this can be mitigated if Commerce defines more targets for some of the subtype categories. That's a good detailed comment. Once again, I'm not sure I can respond to it. I will have I will respond that kind of in my brainstorming, I thought there could be a high, medium, and low other category, perhaps. Once again, that's just brainstorming. I haven't got an answer on that. And certainly the information gathered in Seattle, categorizations of Energy Star Portfolio Manager will influence the target setting activities. All right, that ends my questions in the chat box here, or comments. Back to the room. Any last notes from the room on the subjects we've covered?
Hey, Chuck, it looks like another one came in through the chat box.
Okay. There's another one. High volume buildings, high roofs. but comparatively small square footage. For example, our area has a large, high-volume refrigerated frozen goods warehouse. It has relatively high energy consumption per square foot, but below energy consumption per unit volume. This was a design consideration. How will atypical geometries be addressed? Once again, I don't have an answer for that. I appreciate you providing us with that information so we can consider it. All right, I've advanced to what is my final slide. So during our last meeting, we discussed the possibility of some subcommittees. There's one group, buildings without full metering, that have particularly are challenged to develop energy utilization targets. Is there an approach that could be acceptable for those buildings where they can develop their energy utilization target using something other than metered energy? This is of particular interest to government-owned facilities, campuses, where they have a central steam system that is not metered to the buildings. I'm quite frankly not sure what occurs out there in the private sector with respect to this. I'm sure there are other campuses in the private sector where this becomes an issue as well. The other is the commerce and utilities primarily will need to get together and develop the incentive administration. Everyone will be invited to this, but I think it's primarily a commerce utility conversation. And so I simply put those two up as examples. And I want to know if anyone has suggestions either today or in the future, other subcommittees that should be formed up. In saying that, I want to make sure that they are developed around groups with particular issues in applying Standard 100 that can be best addressed through a subcommittee. So one of the other subcommittee ideas was that a subcommittee to discuss unique building characterizations, adjustment considerations. That's a reasonable suggestion, but I think that's probably a subject for everybody and will be covered largely in the group chats, these larger meetings. I think everybody's interested in that. So I get to sit down now.
All right. Thank
Emily's
you
going to close this out.
All right. Well, again, thank you everybody for the flexibility today, given the circumstances on Interstate 5. We are ending earlier than we had expected. We don't feel like the sheer volume of remote participation really lends itself to have the workshop and discussion that we had planned for today. We'll be revising our agenda for our December 4th meeting. Again, that will be at the Smart Building Center to take into account what we weren't able to accomplish today. So stay tuned and check the Commerce website for updates on that. Austin's got some process notes about public comment. Austin, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I just want to provide a reminder that for our first meeting, public comment is due December 2nd. We are giving that extra week as we know everybody's kind of doing a big data upload to figure this out. The public comment period I'm suggesting ends for this meeting ends December 6th. That's only 4 days after the December 2nd deadline. So we recognize that, but our hope is that you will take that into consideration and realize that we're kind of just trying to give you an extra week for the December 2nd one, given Thanksgiving and all. So there might be some leeway there, but we don't want to get too far behind on these public comments because we really appreciate your feedback and want to build it in to our workshops as we go. And that's all I have at this time.
Emily and Chuck? This is Greg Hannon. We're having trouble getting into the system here, but I think you can hear me now. On the subcommittee ideas, one other issue we may want to do a deeper dive on, and while we'll probably have conversations in the larger meetings, I think it'll take a lot of focused effort, is the whole life cycle cost analysis that's found in section 3. That might be an idea for a subcommittee. Focus.
I appreciate that. We're going to introduce that first as a full subject in December. You know, we'll bring it to one of the bigger meetings. If it looks like it steers off into a few people, that may work out.
Thank you, Greg. All right, any last comments or questions from participants? All right, well, on that note, we thank you everybody for your participation today. Again, thank you for the flexibility given our shifting schedule due to I-5, and we hope to see you all in Seattle on December 4th.
Thank you all.